Most of us have lots of questions for God, even when we believe and trust in Him. How should I be living my life? What does it look like to live for God at work or school or in the home? And when life is difficult, we can easily find ourselves asking, where is God for me now? Or as we look at all that's wrong in the world around us, we can wonder, is God really in control? I'm David Ingle, founder of Burning Heart. And for the last year or so, I've been exploring the Bible book of Daniel. And questions like that are at its heart. It's a famous, exciting, and confusing book, with some of both the best and least well-known bits of the Old Testament. It's known for its dramatic stories of ravenous lions, fiery furnaces, and power struggles between God and great kings and emperors. But it's also full of strange visions that lots of us tend to steer clear of, because they're just too difficult and weird for us to get our heads around. But behind the drama and strangeness is a very familiar challenge. God's people find themselves in a world where God seems to have lost, and a confident and dominant culture with different values and a different agenda to God's seems to carry all before it. As foreign kings overcome the southern kingdom of Israel, Judah, and Jerusalem, four friends find themselves caught up in the middle of it all: Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And as they enter into a life of exile and captivity, they must have wondered, does God still reign? Does God still care? And what am I going to do about it? And we wrestle with those same challenges and questions as we navigate a post-Christian world and culture. And in this series, we're going to explore how Daniel helps us find God's answers. I'll be visiting places that help bring it to life for me, and meeting with friends, old and new, who've wrestled with this in their own lives, as we see how in these pages we hear God's resounding yes. God does still reign. God does still care. And that changes everything for us and how we live our lives today.
What do we know about Daniel? Daniel in the lion's den.
Lions, crazy king, Nebuchadnezzar.
Interpreting dreams.
For me, he was always like a very good and a very high example of faith and faithfulness to God.
He trusted God, he put his faith in God. He knew that God was the ultimate judge and not man.
What I really know about him is that he was a firm man in his beliefs, and he trusted in the Lord.
The book of Daniel is famous for its stories of deliverance. God rescuing Daniel from a lion's den, or his three friends from execution in a fiery furnace. The irony is that the book is often far more focused on those moments when God does not deliver us or do what we want. It all opens with a moment of disaster and profound trauma, with the defeat and subjugation of the southern Israelite kingdom of Judah by the all-conquering king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. As part of the peace, a small group of young men were carried off into captivity in Babylon, including Daniel and his three friends. Across the gap of centuries, it's easy to lose sight of the horror of that moment. This is one of London's less well-known landmarks, the Belgian Refugees Memorial. It remembers the tens of thousands of Belgians whose lives were uprooted and shattered by the First World War, many of whom came here to London. And I find places like this help me to stop and look beyond the numbers and history to the stories and tragedies of the people behind them, and of people like them, like Daniel and his friends. They were young men, just teenagers, suddenly ripped away from all they'd ever known. And as they left and Jerusalem faded into the distance, they must have known they'd never again see the faces of those they loved. Mothers, fathers, family, friends. Never again join the happy throng in worship in the temple. Never again gaze on the city and homeland they loved. Instead, they were thrust into a vast and alien city and culture. Privileged in many ways, but never again free. Never again home. I wonder, how might you or I have felt in that moment? I want to try and understand more, and so I'm meeting someone who has first-hand experience of leaving home in the shadow of war, Veronika Kopilash. She left Kyiv in the face of the Russian invasion, not a captive, but not by choice either. First of all, Veronika, thank you so much for meeting up. I know you left Kyiv on the last flight. Can you tell us a bit about that?
I've been working for Alpha for years, and they received this word from God that I need to get out of the country. On the next morning, I received that call from my friend that the war started, and the whole world collapsed in front of me. It was such a weird feeling that it's a last flight, and now your country in a war, and there is no way back for you now because you're already somewhere else and all borders are closed. I was terrified.
And what would you say is the most difficult thing about being here, having to have left home?
I think the most difficult thing is that you can see people live their life and everything is fine to everyone, and you feel like you're so separated because you're not fine. We started to pray here in UK with all the Ukrainians that been already here. Every night, we didn't feel like we're weak. No, we had this power, and a lot of miracles actually happened while we've been praying. So I think you just need to rely more on God. That's the thing when you read about Daniel. He relied his whole life on him. I'm not thinking that he wasn't scary and he was quite fine. Lions, okay, let's go to them. No, he was a human being. He definitely felt something, but he has such a strong faith, in his God, that God is able to save him. And even if he wouldn't, still, it was I will do this. So for me, it's so important to have that faith and to rely on God more, not on your own strengths, on your own feelings and on your own capability, because we're not that good without him.
Thank you so much. It was so moving and powerful to hear what you had to say.
It was a pleasure.
It's heartbreaking to hear what Veronika's been through. And stories like hers remind us of how much is wrong in our world. And it's difficult not to ask what's going on and where is God in it all? And thankfully, most of us will never experience something like that. And yet, even so, we do experience pain and suffering and heartache. And I find there's a tension in my life. I've seen amazing answers to prayer and guidance and miracles. I know that God is great and I've experienced his goodness. And yet, seemingly not always. I've buried my father, wept at the grave of friends, and known countless smaller struggles in work and ministry, in relationships, in life. One thing I love about Daniel is that it seems to inhabit that same tension in faith that we do, but somehow on a grander scale. There are amazing miracles and deliverance, those famous stories of when God delivers Daniel and his friends from certain death. And yet they never go home. And 70 years later, when we find Daniel praying in chapter 9, we discover that those wounds and sorrows are still raw and fresh as he cries out to God for an end to the exile. So what do we make of it? And how do we understand and reconcile that tension and then live our lives in the light of it? And those questions are at the heart of Daniel. And we find them addressed in three key ways. Through stories of these four friends, through power clashes between God and the great kings and empires they lived under, and through strange apocalyptic visions. And each of them answers the same key questions. Does God still reign? Does God still care? And What difference does that make to me and how I live my life? But each of them answers in a different way and from a different perspective. The Houses of Parliament are the centre of government and authority in the UK. Their scale, beauty and grandeur, designed to showcase the wealth and power of a nation. It can be quite an overwhelming place to be, but this is the sort of place where Daniel and his friends end up, working at the heart of government for two great empires. And because of that, it's also the backdrop for the first way I want to explore in which Daniel addresses those big questions. The power clashes between God and various kings, starting with Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. They were the greatest human powers on earth, lords of their empires and all conquering. But God takes them on and shows that next to him, they're nothing. More than that, actually, because he shows not only his rule and reign over earthly power, but over the very forces of nature, lions, fires, even life and death. It's grand, dramatic, and clear. God does reign. But how then do wicked kings rule and godless empires and cultures rise and prevail? Where is God then? Does he command the tides of history, or is he just a sort of divine superhero? Great in the moment, but carried along like the rest of us. And so we come to the second way in which God answers our questions here. God sends dreams and visions to Daniel to show him what is going to come to pass. Symbolic visions that are scarily accurate and detailed about people and events centuries into the future. Daniel's future, that is, but our past. Because we can know the stories and read of the conquests of Alexander the Great 200 years after Daniel's death, or the abominations of a much lesser man, Antiochus IV of Syria, another 200 years further on, and see in Daniel's visions that God knew every detail before one of them came to pass. He is the Lord, even of the great sweeps and movements of history. God does reign. But isn't that all a bit impersonal? The ebbs and flows of history, great kings and great empires, but no room and no thought for the rest of us. Does God care about me? Or are we just the collateral damage in his cosmic plans? And so we come to the third way in which God answers our questions here. The stories of Daniel and his friends, caught up in the crosswinds of history, carried off into exile, but not forgotten by God. We never know why them, but we do know that God was with them in their pain and struggles, sometimes in small ways, helping them navigate life in their new context, sometimes in big ways, rescuing them from certain death at the hands of kings and lions and fires, but always there, even in foreign Babylon, even in exile, even when they might have felt alone and forgotten, they weren't. God did still care, God did still love them. And whatever pains and traumas we face in life, even if we feel lost and forgotten by God, even if we never know why, we can always know that God cares about us. God loves you. But why, if God reigns and God cares, does he not always put things right? And that brings us to the final dimension of Daniel, sin and salvation. And at the heart of all the problems and traumas of this book are the sins and brokenness of people, of us. And sometimes there's a direct link. And there's a wonderful prayer in chapter 9 where Daniel says, "We and our kings, our princes and our ancestors are covered with shame, Lord, because we have sinned against you." In the exile, Israel was paying the price for her sin and rejection of God. And Daniel owns his part in that. We have sinned, and he cries out for mercy, forgiveness, and restoration. But often there's no link between my sin and my suffering, and we're not guilty or responsible for whatever has happened to us. Daniel was probably less guilty than most, but there he was, first into exile. And there we need a bigger answer and a bigger solution. And that bigger solution is at the heart of Daniel. The centerpiece of the whole book comes in chapter 7. It's not one of the bits we tend to know that well because it's one of the strange and terrifying visions. But the author of the book uses lots of artistry and skill, language, structure, repetition, difference, to try and focus our attention on it. And the first clue is actually missing in any translation because the book was originally written in 2 different languages. Hebrew in chapters 1 and 8 to 12, and Aramaic in the bit in between, chapters 2 to 7, which immediately highlights 7 as the climax of something important. And that's then reinforced by the structure of the Aramaic bit. It starts with a dream and finishes with this vision, and the 2 show us the same things and deliver the same message. And then the book is famously and obviously divided into 2 types of writing. The first half in chapters 1 to 6 is narrative, stories of the 4 friends and the power clashes between God and the kings they served, while the second half in chapters 7 to 12 is full of strange visions. But the join comes in a different place this time. Chapter 7 was the end of the Aramaic, but it's the start of the visions. And altogether, the effect is to circle and highlight this one chapter at the heart of it all. And it's a vision of the great earthly empires of Daniel's day and beyond. But each one is presented not in its glory and beauty, but in its darkness. Great, terrifying beasts rising up out of the sea, a horrifying vision and verdict on the glories of this world, exposing the realities of the sin and darkness present in all worldly power, and hinting at the pain and suffering they cause. And yet, in the end, the last beast is cast down, and our gaze shifts to heaven, and we see a figure described as one like a son of man coming with the clouds, and he's led before God and given an everlasting kingdom. At the heart of all Daniel's visions is Jesus. Jesus who calls himself the Son of Man countless times in the Gospels. Jesus who told the high priest at his trial that this was him. Jesus who through his death and resurrection did what no one else could do, undoing the power of the beasts and sin and death and pain and suffering, and ushering in an everlasting kingdom of righteousness and joy. Life, history, all the pain and struggle, none of it makes any sense without Jesus. But seen in the light of that vision, of that hope, seen in the light of Jesus, everything looks different. And even if in this moment, in this life, we struggle and wonder, on the grandest of scales, we can know that God does care, God does reign, and God will win. And in the meantime, we can rest in him and look to that future with hope, because we will share in that future. The last words of the book of Daniel. As for you, Daniel, you will rest, and then at the end of days you will rise to receive your allotted inheritance.